Whenever I record these lectures, I have to wait for the video to like convert after I'm done with each one. So in between each video, I have to like pause and I get to play my game between them every time. So I'm excited about that. We're back now. So I'm gonna record part 2 of the leadership lecture and I'm gonna get started. So hopefully you can see my screen there. Looks like it's working. And we are talking about leader emergence and development in this part. So we talked about what a leader is, we talked about positions or sources of power, and now we're going to go into what causes a leader to emerge, who's a leader, how are they effective, how do we develop leaders, and so on. So one of the first things you might be interested in, and if you're starting to notice a trend in IO, one thing we love to do is look at individual differences. And our favorite individual differences are, if you remember from that lecture, cognitive ability and personality. So this meta-analysis, which if you also remember what that is, looking at multiple different studies on leadership and personality, this meta-analysis by Judge and its colleagues, Judge, looked at the 5-factor model, which is our favorite personality model. Remember the ocean, the 5 factors, as well as what leaders emerge. So kind of when I was talking about the last video, the way that we study leader emergence, we looked at all these different studies about leaders that collected data about the people in the groups and who emerged as leaders and what their traits were. So of the 5-factor model, which of the big 5 personality traits do you think would predict leader emergence? So think back, extroversion, conscientiousness, openness to experience, agreeableness, and neuroticism or emotional stability. So think about that for a second. If you can remember what they are, I will just give you the results now. So what was found was these are the correlation coefficients between these personality traits and the leader emergence. So extroversion had 0.31, conscientiousness 0.28. Openness to experience and emotional stability were both 0.24, and agreeableness was only 0.08, and this was not significant. So one thing to be aware of, and I think I've covered this before, but just to remind you guys, you can have a correlation that looks small and it's still significant, which means it's still meaningful. And you can have a correlation that looks large and it's not significant, which means it doesn't actually mean anything. It could be due to chance. In this case with meta-analyses, we usually expect, because we have large sample sizes in a meta-analysis, we usually expect that the correlations might be small to moderate, but it's going to be significant. So in this case, if you look again at these specific numbers, they're all kind of on the small to moderate side, except for agreeableness, which is a very small correlation, and they found it was not significant. So being agreeable, so warm and friendly and likable and kind, has no relationship with emerging as a leader, but the others all did have a relationship. And of course, extroversion was the strongest of the big 5 traits to predict leader effectiveness, followed closely by conscientiousness. And I put this little picture of Tony Stark on here because I do think that he's probably the most extroverted and possibly one of the most conscientious members of the Avengers. So it's not surprising that he might emerge as a leader. But if you think about it, think about these personality traits, go back and look at their definitions, and think if you feel that leaders you've had or people who have kind of emerged as leaders in groups you've been in share some of these personality traits. I think it makes sense. A leader has to be someone who puts themselves out there, who is very, outgoing and sociable in order to be, seen as a leader by others. So extroversion makes sense. And conscientiousness has a really strong relationship, remember, with performance. So a conscientious person might also emerge as a leader. Maybe do a better job at whatever the task is. And other meta-analyses also talk about this difference between men and women as leaders. And this is something that's important to talk about. Men tend to emerge as leaders a lot more often than women do. So if you have a mixed group, way more often than not, the person who emerges as the leader by, judgments of everyone in the group, who kind of just sort of over time becomes this person who leads, most likely it's going to be one of the male people in the group. But other research shows that despite the fact that men are going to more frequently be leaders, women and men are equally effective as leaders. There's no actual evidence to support that one gender is inherently better at leadership than the others. In fact, and I'll get into this a bit in a later section of this lecture, some of the leadership styles that are more effective, they have nothing to do with gender, first of all. They're just behaviors that leaders can engage in that are effective behaviors for a leader. But some of these behaviors, in fact, a lot of them, are the types of things that women are more inclined to engage in than men. So when I say that gender has nothing to do with leadership, I mean inherently there's really no difference between men and women as leaders. What matters is engaging in certain types of positive behaviors as a leader. And there's some evidence to suggest that as of right now, sometimes women are more likely to engage in those behaviors. But I'll get into that a little later and you might understand why when I do. But we just know right now that these same researchers, specifically Eagley and Corral, who are listed on here as citations, they have a theory called role congruity theory that is backed up by loads and loads of research. And I do believe I've actually briefly mentioned this in class before when we're talking about, discrimination and diversity, that there's just these natural, kind of going back to stereotypes that we have, roles that we believe that men and women should fill. And regardless of whether or not you would openly state that you agree with those roles, we all actually have these biases inherent in us that are kind of just put there because of our experiences. So the more you're exposed to things, the more things become associated in your brain. No matter how much you want to fight it, it's already going to be kind of implanted in your subconscious. And requires a lot of kind of rethinking and conscious awareness to be able to combat these stereotypes. And that leads into this idea of role congruity theory, which states that we are uncomfortable when people are filling roles that we don't believe are congruent with the roles they're supposed to fill. And role congruity theory says leadership is congruent with men. It's something that we naturally tend to associate with masculinity and masculine traits, and that women engaging in leadership behaviors are kind of doing things that's incongruent with what their role should be, and it makes us more uncomfortable. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that people tend to respond more negatively to women as leaders because of this, because we feel it kind of affects how, communal and kind and traditionally feminine that we want them to be. So in essence, it's not even a matter of men being more extroverted or conscientious. It's not a matter of men engaging in more leader behaviors. It's just that people are going to naturally flock more to a leader that's male because in our minds, we think that's congruent, that's right. So a man and a woman can be engaging in exactly the same behaviors, and it's likely that people would say, the man is engaging like a leader, he's acting like a leader, we're going to follow him. But the woman is like making us uncomfortable, or she's being, it's the classic being a boss versus being bossy thing. So unfortunately, even though things are changing a bit over time, there's still a lot of evidence that this is the case when it comes to men versus women in leadership. Another thing to think about is race and ethnicity. However, unfortunately, a lot of research and even diversity research, as they call it, doesn't really look at race or ethnicity in leadership. It's a big gap in IO. I think that a lot of the diversity research focuses just on men and women and doesn't even account for race at all, even though not only should we be thinking about race, but we should also be thinking about other subgroups and also the interactions between these groups. So for example, we can't just compare men and women, and we can't just compare white and black people. We have to compare white men, white women, black women, and every other race and every other combination that's out there, because it's not going to be the same for every group. And unfortunately, this area is still under a lot of work, and there's not really a lot out there. I did my master's thesis project kind of in this area of trying to get more into the multiple group categories, but we still need a lot more done, and there are people out there who are doing the work, but right now there's very little. But we do know that when you compare just broadly races of leaders, that we tend to see higher ratings of effectiveness for white leaders than other races in the United States specifically. And the same reason applied to the men and women. Not necessarily that, like men and women, it's because of prescribed gender roles where men are supposed to be more assertive and agentic and women are supposed to be more communal and relationship oriented. With race, that may not be exactly why, because I don't think that specific stereotype exists. But we do have what we call implicit leadership theories, which means kind of just this idea of when you close your eyes and you think of leader, what do you think of? Especially in the United States, when you consider that 95% of our presidents have been white, and so on. All of these major leaders are white, and specifically white men. It makes sense that people's just prototypical leader is a white guy. So these are the things that where you get into this idea that representation matters and having more leaders who are people of color and women can make a big difference because not only will it's not just to give those people power or something, but it's also to promote equality for all, to promote opportunities for all, and that gets back into kind of the stuff that we discussed or I talked about in the last lecture on diversity and fairness. Um, but yes, all the evidence right now that we have, even though we do need to do more research in this area, right now it shows that people tend to prefer white male leaders to any other group. So once we have our leaders, we might be interested also in measuring their effectiveness and their development by how their outcomes are. So, you always have to compare, and we've talked about this in every other area of this field as well, your predictor and your outcome. So your predictor, if it's the leadership type or the leadership specific leader, and then your outcomes of leadership. But this can be a really difficult task, um, mainly because it's super difficult to isolate leadership and outcomes um, away from every other possible influence. So leadership affects and is affected by everything else going on in the organization. So just like we always have these confounds and these third variables that can influence our correlations, this is going to occur doubly with leadership. We can't say for certain that the leader is the reason why we improved our sales. It could be the workers, it could be the season, it could be the situation. So it's really hard because we can't isolate it. It's also really hard because the effects of leadership are not always immediate. You can't just have a leader do A and then immediately B happens. So direct supervisors might see more immediate results, someone who works directly with the subordinates. But when you're going all the way to the top, the outcomes may take longer to occur. So it's hard to measure and be sure that this is happening. So that's why we can't really measure an outcome or an effectiveness outcome of leadership as a global construct, meaning like one broad thing. We should maybe combine a bunch of different indicators and put them together to get a global score of leadership. That way, if one of them is affected by one thing and another thing is affected by another thing, they might balance each other out a bit and you can kind of get an idea. So you want to base it on specific observable actions that the leader took. Um, and that may include things that are a little bit out of the leader's control. So again, basically, your best bet is to really be specific about the leader's behavior, measure it specifically, and then when the performance measures, look for outcomes that you really believe have to do with the leader's performance, and they have to be based on really specific behaviors of the leader, and then the outcomes have to be multiple and kind of combined and triangulated to get this idea of an indicator of their overall leadership. There's no perfect way to do this in an organization because there's too much going on that you have to account for, but we do the best we can by collecting pretty much as much data as possible. So I'm going to talk briefly about the difference between leaders, managers, and supervisors. I already defined a leader, but here's another definition for you. So the leader is an individual in a group given the task of directing task-relevant group activities, or, in the absence of a designated leader, carrying the primary responsibility for performing these functions in the group. So there's a couple types of leadership that can occur from this definition. So there's attempted leadership, where you try to exert power or influence over someone. Successful leadership, when you do exert power or influence over someone else. And effective leadership, when you are exerting power or influence over someone else, and there is a mutual feeling from that of satisfaction. So some examples of this from our fun little Avengers example is Loki would be an attempted leader. He wanted to control everyone, but he kind of failed. Thanos would be someone who successfully exerted power and influence. And Steve Rogers would be someone who did effective leadership. I'm sure you've all had people in your lives, either at work or outside of work, who have done any one of these. Try to think of an example of people you've had in your life who've attempted to be leaders, but maybe they just tried to exert power and influence and it didn't really happen. The people who did exert power and influence, whether or not it worked out for the best, and then people who you felt were really good and successful leaders, and you had a feeling of satisfaction from that. But that's just a broad leaders, and they can emerge kind of out of any group, like that definition talked about. You could just be on a team that doesn't have a designated leader, and one of those three types of leaders could emerge. However, there's also managers and supervisors, and those are the formal leaders. Remember, those people who are formally designated to have power in a situation. And the difference between these two, as defined by the textbook, although they're sometimes used interchangeably, is that a manager is usually tasked with implementing initiatives, enforcing policies, overseeing subordinates, planning and organizing, and carrying out other various duties. Whereas the supervisor is usually just tasked with overseeing subordinates. So a manager might be kind of like one step above the supervisor. So they might be used interchangeably sometimes, but it's kind of a lower level manager if you're even going to call them that. So it can even happen, like one example that I could think of is when I was a server, we had one server in every shift who was considered the shift lead. So they were kind of the supervisor, but they were not a manager of the store. They were just the person who was kind of like designated for that shift to kind of oversee everyone else and make sure everyone is doing all of their work that they're supposed to be doing. So going into this idea of leader development, how do we define that? First of all, leader development is defined as the expansion of the capacity of individuals to be effective in leadership roles and processes. So leader development focuses on the individual. So you might have one person who you want to make become a leader, then you're engaging in leader development. However, it also includes leadership development, which is just the growth of a collective's capacity to produce direction, alignment, and commitment, i.e. leadership. And that focuses on the environment. So basically, this is the difference between creating an environment that promotes good leadership and that makes leaders emerge versus just specifically focusing on an individual to lead. So effective leadership is also most likely to occur when you have multiple people in a group engaging in leader behaviors and not just the one formal leader. So you couldn't really have a successful organization if only the CEO was the leader. You need other types of leadership and people throughout the hierarchy, some at the same level as each other, some slightly above each other or below each other, but you can't have just one formal leader. Additionally, we know that people have differences in their motivation to become leaders. So one study talked about how motivation to lead is comprised of three things. One is power motive, which is a desire to attain control and power that results from people learning that the exercise of control over others or the environment is pleasing. So this is where we get into that idea that power might be a negative thing, and people who kind of become leaders might be doing it for the wrong reasons. They have this desire to have and exert power over others, And personally, I don't know about you guys, but I think that if I'm talking to someone or if I know of someone who just wants to have power over other people and derives pleasure from that, I think that that person's a little sketchy and I don't really trust them, you know? So, as unfortunate as it is, because we need good and effective leaders who the research shows are better leaders if they care more about their followers. Unfortunately, the people who pursue positions of power are often just doing it out of the pleasure of having powers over others. And then the second factor in the motivation to lead is activity inhibition. I'm sorry, which is the ability to control their impulses. So it's people who are able to strategically carry out plans and initiatives. And this is a skill that could go either way in terms of being good or bad. Um, the part of me that's like really into like true crime and stuff just immediately thinks, oh my gosh, like a psychopath would have both of these first two things, right? But a lot of times the people you don't want in positions of power are also really volatile and emotional and angry, and they wouldn't really have this ability to be strategic and carry out plans. They would be more, prone to mood swings and impulsive actions, right? So that second one there could go either way, depending on if the person is kind of very controlled emotionally for good reasons or not. And the third one is affiliation need, and this one is actually the opposite. People who are motivated to lead are often lower in affiliation need because this is um, this need for approval from others. And if you're low in affiliation need, you're able to remain distant and objective. And and this one I'm also a little, iffy about because you don't want people who are too volatile and emotional and only responding to positive interactions with others. I won't say any names, but I know that you all know of a certain leader who tends to not remain objective and care a lot about whether or not people are talking positively about him. But this one says that, someone who's motivated to lead will often be someone who's able to remain objective, stay socially distant, doesn't feel the need for approval. And so this is a good one because leaders often do bear the brunt of responsibilities, and it may occur that they, have to step on some toes when to get something done, and they need to be able to not, cave under that pressure. But they also, we also have evidence that leaders should care a little bit about the people that they're leading. So it could go either way. It could be a positive thing, but too much of it might be a negative thing as well. However, it does predict a motivation to lead. Now, I think someone who might have all three of these could be a good or bad leader, but I think just having one of these factors might also result in people wanting to. Um, so just think about them and examples of that as well. According to that original model, the sole motive or driving force behind a person's motivation to leave is that first one, that power motive. I don't know that that's true, and other researchers have also thought maybe that's not true. What are some other reasons that maybe weren't talked about that could make people motivated to leave? I'm sure you can think of several, and I'm sure that it could depend a lot on the situation, right? It could be just you care about one very specific type of goal and you want to lead towards that. Well, for at least a little bit of expansion on that theoretically, um, Chan and Draskow also proposed that motivation to lead is comprised of three things, but they were three different things. So they described, let's go through them one by one. Affective identity, which is just a general desire to be a leader. It's similar to the power motive, but I think it's worded a little bit nicer where it's not so much just like I'm excited to control other people, it's more just I want to be a leader. So that's a neutral way of putting it where it's not sounding inherently like a necessarily a what's the word, malevolent or nefarious motive. It's just I want to lead. The second one is instrumental, which is the desire to lead because of access to valuable benefits. So being a leader can result in some good positive outcomes, maybe more money, maybe it's more prestige and power, whatever it is, there's some benefit to being a leader that you find appealing and that makes you want to be a leader. And the third is social normative, which is the feeling of duty or social obligation to lead. And I think that might be more of a honorable, if you will, motive to lead, where someone feels something that needs to be done and somebody needs to do it, so why not me kind of motive. So I think that this one covers more broadly all of the reasons that people can lead. It is definitely more useful when you're trying to categorize motives to lead. All right, so that will sum up me talking about these ideas of leader emergence, development, and types of leaders. But I will get into history and theories of leadership in the next video. So go ahead and click over on that one whenever you are ready.